They're finally here, AMD's new Ryzen 7000 non-X models. And today I'm going to tell you why you don't need that X. Welcome everyone to Gamer Melt. While they were only announced a few days ago, AMD sent over their non-X models a little while back for me to test, so thanks for that. But of course, that won't affect my review. Either way, I did run a ton of benchmarks to test out these CPUs and see how they compared to their X counterparts. To quickly go over them, we have the Ryzen 9 7900, the Ryzen 7 7700, and the Ryzen 5 7600. The primary difference between the non-X models and their X counterparts, besides price, is the lower TDP to 65 watts. Instead of 170 for the Ryzen 9 part and 105 for the Ryzen 7 and 5 parts. So it is a significant drop in wattage, and that lowers the boost clock of the 7900 by 200 MHz, the 7700 by 100 MHz, and the 7600 by 200 MHz. Now, those clocks aren't the whole story, because the way AMD determines boost clocks can be a bit confusing. See, that number is essentially the maximum clock your CPU can get on a single core without manual overclocking, but it's heavily dependent on thermal headroom, so as your workload increases across more cores, the lower your CPU clock will get. For example, during a heavily threaded workload like Cinebench, which typically maxes out all of your cores, the CPU won't get near that boost clock. Minus the 7600X, which can get over the non-X boost clock on every core. The wattage drop is really the problem though, and that ends up hurting performance way more than the boost clock suggests. As you can see in this Cinebench test between the 7900 and 7900X at default settings, the 7900X wins by a whopping 18%. This is more or less shown in the much lower base frequency for the non-X models, which AMD doesn't advertise. Though honestly my parts typically got higher than even the base frequency of the X parts. So the base frequency isn't all that important here. It's just that 65 watt TDP that holds them back. Now, you're probably wondering why I'm saying to get the non-X parts. Well, that's because of three things. 1. Precision Boost Overdrive. Once you turn on PBO in either your BIOS or AMD's Ryzen Master software, you're able to unlock a ton of performance, because it takes away that 65 watt TDP limit. As you can see, every CPU got very close to their X model in multi-threaded workloads, and AMD even discusses this in their reviewer's guide. In fact, it's really wild, because in multiple heavily threaded workloads, my 7900 non-X model actually beat its X counterpart. The lower end parts don't see as much of an uplift with PBO because they have fewer cores and therefore more thermal headroom at 65 watts. But even without Precision Boost Overdrive, they're pretty close to the X models. So that's it? Non-X is better? Well, it's a bit more complicated than that, because there's something a lot of people don't know. Precision Boost Overdrive does not raise your clock speed above the rated boost clock. What it does is raise the power limits like the package power tracking, thermal design current, etc., as well as the max wattage for the non-X parts. So you can get mostly the same performance out of both the X and non-X parts in heavily threaded workloads. But because the max boost remains the same in single or few core workloads where the CPUs can get to that max boost, the X model can get a tiny bit faster, but barely, because we're mostly talking one core. As you can see in these single core synthetic benchmarks, the X model wins here. But that's where we move to a clock offset. Normally you can do the auto overclock with 200 MHz higher in Ryzen Master, but it never wanted to stick, though it would crash on restart a lot, so that could be why. Luckily, I was able to get it to work within the BIOS, and the single core score did go up, but it wasn't as high as the X model because it seemed to bounce to different cores a lot. Even the multi-core score went up a bit, but only on the lower end model. The 7900 multi-core score went down a bit, likely because it reached its thermal limit and throttled down faster. Another weird quirk is that the 7700 and 7600 wouldn't let me pull as much power as the X models, so the multi-core score wasn't as good, and that's where the final answer comes in. With a manual overclock on the 7600, I was able to overclock every core to the 7600's boost clock of 5.3 GHz. With that, I actually got above the multi-core performance against the 7600X. But the single core did go down, so there are ups and downs to each answer. But here's the thing, even when it had an offset, it was very close. And that's really the takeaway here. The performance was very close with Precision Boost Overdrive or the 200 MHz offset. Surprisingly, in some games, which are notorious for not using a ton of cores, the non-X models actually won. Even at 1080p medium settings and using an RX 7900 XT to remove the GPU bottleneck, they were barely different in much of anything. And that difference will certainly disappear if you move it to 1440p or 4K. That is, once you turn on Precision Boost Overdrive. Ultimately, I'd argue that it's not worth, say, $50 or more to get the X model. Sure, if it's just $10 more, it might be worth it for you. And I know the 7600X and 7700X are close to the non-X price according to the announcement, but I'm hoping that AMD will lower the price shortly after. Basically, there's rarely ever going to be a reason to buy the X model. Sure, you could maybe do an offset on the X model, but it won't help the heavily threaded workloads at all. And if you need a fan, the non-X models come with one. So it's a win-win all around. So while that does it for today, what CPU are you hoping to get? Let me know down in the comments below. And if you liked the video, please subscribe. And as always, have a great day.